Good to see you all. My name is Michael Dila. I am the director of a project called Oslo for AI, which is a project to do diplomatic work between different AI communities who are not talking well to each other, but who need to for the sake of governance and much else. I'm excited to get to the conversation with the panel. Before I do, I want to ask you some questions. So if you could answer them with a show of hands, a clear, nice, big raise of your hand. The first question is, do you think that intelligence is well understood? Raise your hand if you think yes. Okay. Do you think we have a well-established consensus on the potential harms of AI systems? Raise your hand if yes. Okay, 3 of you, good. Do you believe we have existing models of governance capable of regulating emerging technology? Raise your hand if yes. Okay, so just based on that very negative show of hands on those questions, I think that's a very good benchmark for where we are in the governance conversation. If we were going to be doing really careful, thoughtful governance work, we would have better answers to all of those questions. So I'll just, my first offer to you is, those are 3 questions we should all be thinking more about and talking more about. Each of the panelists today, in I hope what are going to be non-obvious ways, have something different to tell us about how to think about governance. So I'm going to go to each of them in turn. Dennis will be first, Malur next, and Kim will follow up. So first of all, Dennis, can you tell us a little bit about your background, and then you can tell them about the mistake you made that landed you on this stage.
Sure. My name's Dennis Gleason. I am a recovering political analyst in the CIA and analytic methodologist. I can't stress the word former enough in that everything that I'm about to say is really kind of my opinion. I made the horrible mistake of committing thoughts to the internet. Which was, there was a really interesting article in MIT Technology Review about how AI grokked its way to understanding basic arithmetic. And one of the conversations Michael and I have had for about a year now is the volume and diversity of writing about AI is so huge, it's hard to actually keep abreast of what everyone is saying. And so my question was, well, let's run a thought experiment. If we took everything that's been written about our hopes and our fears and our concerns about AI and put it into an AI and said, hey, AI, we need you to generate 100 generations of AI governance policy. What comes out after 100 iterations? And so that's how I ended up here.
All right. Malur, you are running technology development at an AI company called Latimer. Maybe you can tell the folks a little bit about what Latimer is, the problems you're working on, and where you are in the play.
Sure. So Latimer is a large language model that is trained on Black history and Black culture. And the intent is to make sure that you have inclusive voices, inclusive representation of the data, and therefore less biased. My own background, I started my career in machine learning 34 years ago, building reinforcement learning algorithms in C++ and C. And I can't believe that 34 years later, here we are talking about governance and how AI should be managed and how bias should be managed.
Yeah, thank you. All right, and Kim, I know a lot of your career has been spent doing UX and design research. You are on the cusp of finishing a PhD in the intersection of rhetoric and AI. Yeah. And I know you have some thoughts about language and the architecture of language and the effect that it's having or could have on governance?
Yeah, so I'm going to step back a little bit and just give a little bit wider, broader stroke of my stance. So I identify culturally as French Creole. I am from the CARICOM nation, one of the CARICOM nations, St. Lucia. And so I speak a language that they also speak in Haiti. And so my interest really in this space is multifaceted. Before doing that, of course, not before, but rather after, I also led very large design teams. I led the first team at a company in Canada, now defunct, called BlackBerry. And I raised the team from 4 BlackBerry folks, from 4 interns to about 56 folks. And so that's up in Waterloo. And I also led a team at Autodesk, taking the first instance of the cloud version of a tool called Maya. It's a 3D animation software. And so I did that as well, just so I'm not that kind of designer who does interfaces. Let me just leave it at that. So my interest really was in 2017, when I was leading the team at Autodesk, one of the things I noted was that my design team was shrinking. It was getting smaller and smaller, and part of the reason was because we're proceduralizing a lot of the interaction with the user. So instead of having a user go from one screen to the other, they might go from one screen to the other, and AI would do the rest. And so that, I would say, concerned me as a people leader. So I decided to take a break and head back to finish a degree because I had a family. I wanted to go back and really think about design at not that physical level of what happens in the UI, but rather what happens at a very intellectual level of the ontologies that we think about when we think about designing. And so my area of, hopefully expertise is in a space called computational rhetoric. And so it's at the confluence of mathematics, computer science, as well as the humanities. And so I'm here today with the group for many reasons. I think there's a lot of overlap in both of the things that we do. But one of the things that Michael and I have been talking about a lot is I'm very much inspired by Lev Menovich. And 20 years ago, I read his book around the chapter, Metaphors of Computing. And it struck me then that the language by which we currently discuss AI is so fundamentally flawed. And so that's what I hope to unpack as we discuss here on the panel. So I will pause for now. Hopefully you'll have some other questions for me. Actually, I want to talk about something. So one of the things that interests me where Milo and I overlap is that we have a pending project looking at the impact of AI on CARICOM countries. And the reason is because CARICOM countries represent a lot of the, it provides a groundwork for surfacing a lot of the pains that we see around AI, bias, transparency. We are a creolized part of the world. And I have advanced the idea that I think it lends itself to a very good laboratory testing ground for testing small before we scale. So we could weed out things like biases. But I will talk about that. I have a lighting talk this afternoon, so please join that, and I'll talk about that more.
All right. Malura, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how Latimer is modeling bias and engaging with bias, because I think it's non-obvious just out of the box.
Yeah, so for the last year or so, even longer than that, I've been focused on bias and in general. But specifically around large language models, we've been working on that for a year or so. And the challenge with bias is that it's manifested in many different ways. First of all, the data that exists today that most large language models are trained on are, as we know, are trained on mainstream data that's been scraped from the internet and largely represents, I'd say, 70% white male population data. It's not representative of the larger global audience, and therefore, when a LLM has to respond, it's responding based on that data and based on whatever nuances it has, interpretations it has made from pattern recognition, et cetera. The second part, of course, is there's human bias. The way that your data is labeled, that causes, and how it's stored and how it's searched, that causes a level of, an additional level of bias. And the third is the algorithmic bias itself, because algorithms are trained, machine learning algorithms are trained to be successful in delivering whatever task it is meant to do. Mm-hmm. That is its only purpose. And it's going to do that regardless of what occurs around it. So that's why you have companies that are building large language models putting guardrails, which are like Band-Aids, mm-hmm. to say, hey, you know what, here's what here's don't say these things, don't say those things, avoid these topics, and you'll see when you're talking to ChatGPT or any of those, you get those type of responses. What we've done in Latimer is we've trained the data, we've incremented the data using a RAG model, so we've got additional data from 100 years of newspapers, dissertations, books, textbooks, etc. So to make sure that the data set is more wider and obviously more diverse. And the second thing we're doing is we're building bias detection tools in order to be able to, because bias is so subtle, you can detect a lot of the bias detection tools are really focused on toxicity and those sorts of things today. But very little is based on subtle bias, because so much of bias detection is a human thing. And how you perceive bias depends on your own background, your culture, and whether you're offended by something or not. So that's a real challenge for us, and that's what we're kind of building, so that we have any company that wants to use an LLM has a bias score that they can say as a reference to say this is either positive or negative, and then they can decide how they want to mitigate it.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's one more layer of bias that we tend not to talk about, which is, given that generative AIs are so intuitive to use, we don't talk about bias in the prompts. Like, we just type what's out in our mind. And so,
Correct.
The question is, going through that chain from the data to the algorithm to the user, right? Yeah. How do biases either amplify themselves or cancel one another out? I think that's something that's interesting that I don't see talked about a lot, is the relationship between biases throughout the discovery process.
Well, and one of the things we were talking about last night is, because of the way that generative systems work, when we interact with them and bring our own biases to them, the way we get feedback from the system isn't consistent either. So, we have an unstable model for not only the bias we're bringing into the system, but the bias that's coming back out. I wanted to talk, or have you talk a little bit more, Dennis, about how this poses particular kinds of problems in the intelligence world. And as AI tools appear to be, of course, changing the landscape of everything, how intelligence work might benefit from this kind of technology, and why it isn't benefiting in some of the ways in which you would hope or want it to.
Sure. I think I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit and say I think this is true of all analytic work. That, whether you're talking about an intelligence analyst or whether you're talking about a professor doing research or somebody at a think tank, we talk about the need for explainability and transparency and trustworthiness, and that starts with how data is handled. Mm-hmm. And so I think in order for generative AIs to play a greater role in this high-end analytic work, regardless of where it's being done, it starts with making the data a lot cleaner, kind of enriching it, being very clear about the source of the information, so that the user can say with confidence, it gave me this answer based on this information, and I can push or put against it if I have a problem with the source. The problem is, in my experience, right, is if you sit down and you talk to a group of analysts, they universally say, if the data was cleaner, we could do this amazing stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's great, let me go talk to the developers. And you go across the hall and you say to the developers, the analysts are talking about clean data and it would really help them. And the developers are like, clean data would be so awesome. It'd be like, great, we actually have both halves of this equation agreeing on the problem. How about we all fix it? And suddenly everybody's counting ceiling tiles. Because data cleanup is thankless and it's unsexy, and yet it's really critical as the base of everything that goes further downstream. And so I think until that problem is addressed or people start working on it, it's going to be hard for AI to contribute to the precision analytic work.
Got it.
There is a, if I may,
Yeah.
there is. I asked Perplexity. I think the CEO is here somewhere today. A question. I asked him to come up with a bunch of quotes, and I just want to quote it here. And it came up with a quote that said, "The challenge with AI is not to create a Terminator, but to create a Terminator that takes orders from John Connor." Right. So for those of you who are Terminator fans, and it was attributed to Elon Musk, which is a whole issue of bias on its own. And when you dig deeper, you realize that Elon Musk never said that. But it assumed, the AI assumed that people like Elon Musk must be saying these things. Right. And for me, I have a problem with that quote fundamentally, because if leaders are thinking that way, that is a problem. Because we need to be thinking about not creating a Terminator at all, and really thinking about so that John Connor and his descendants don't have to face Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, building on something you said earlier, Malur, about how Latimer is including new kinds of data and layering that into foundation model data. Kem, you have been talking, I know, and thinking about doing work in CARICOM countries in particular because, one, it's a well-defined sandbox, as it were.
Absolutely.
But also, there's a lot of linguistic diversity, a lot of cultural diversity, which has the potential to enrich models. You want to talk a little bit more about how that might work?
Yeah, I'll talk about that briefly. So it's a project that is actually still at its very infant stages. We're just trying to scope, like, what is it we need to do? So I come from a country where it's a creolized country, but it's a French-English creolization. There's also Papiamento, which is maybe Dutch and English, and all of these. And so one of the things that we find, and if you follow the works of folks like Timnit Gebru and Joy Balumwini from here, you will know that the data that we've captured is really data coming out of the global north, right? And we need to extend that. And the Caribbean itself represents, a lot of people don't know that the Caribbean has over 300 islands with people living on them. Many people will say to me, are you from Jamaica? Are you from Haiti? There are lots of islands and countries in between with very nuanced, deep histories, linguistic histories that we can learn from. So I think that's a place to start. But I want to take the conversation elsewhere just slightly to talk about, how many people have read about bias in AI, transparency? How many people, just by quick show of, see, right? Now, every time I start reading these articles, I just stop. I'm tired of reading the same article that AI is bad, AI, is not transparent and all of that. And so I do write a blog where I, pour my thoughts in there. It's really a primer for defending next semester. But one of the things I think is that the crisis that we see in data is not just a data crisis. It's a humanity crisis, right? We keep on talking about things, and I've actually written a blog to that topic. But I'd like us to really step back and think about new ontologies of discussing this really transformational technology. For example, one of the splits that we're seeing in the AI space right now is one where we have folks who are saying centralization, and we have folks saying decentralization, autonomy, control, specialization, generalization. We need to be able to frame these conversations first before we begin to talk about the cleanness of data to some extent, because that is foundational, to how we begin to talk about that. The other thing I also talk about a lot is that we need to move away from that concept of data lakes, right? When you think about lakes, they can become very messy very soon. So, what is the next thing we need to talk about? Is it data oceans? And how do we actually frame that conversation before we start thinking about this need for innovation and speed in AI? So just to get back to your question, Michael, yes, I do believe, that the work that we're doing in the CARICOM nations, although I do live in Canada, I will be giving a talk there in June, so I can't be here in June. And it is within, it's with the Caribbean Studies Association. So the theme this year is AI and Caribbean economies. So hopefully that is a conversation we can begin to have here with our peers in North America, in the global north, to say, hey, we're open. We want to have you test the AI because we don't want to be the recipient of AI that was not created for us, right? So these are the conversations that I think we've been having collectively. And I think, I'm going to pause for a while because I can go on and on and on.
I just want to add to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add to that. Kim and I were talking about. We were approached by a group in St. Lucia to help with learning, because one of the languages she's speaking with, Patois,
Patois.
is fast declining, and how do you make sure that those languages are, we have history documents in Sudan and all other countries' languages, dialects that are disappearing. So how do we use AI to prevent that? But what I want to talk about is really, when I talk about AI and bias, a lot of people raised hands here, and there's a lot of fatigue around AI, and there's a lot of fatigue around bias. People usually roll their eyes and say, you know what, yeah, I've heard it all. It's not relevant to me, right? And maybe it isn't, but a counterpoint is that the bias has huge implications in terms of business, right? In terms of revenue impact because of brand image. It has impact on the downstream in terms of how you govern, whether it's criminal justice, healthcare, health insurance, any of those factors. All of those have big implications.
Yeah, so that's a great. I'm gonna start to land the plane. You gave me a great inroad to when I was working in the Defense Department. The leader that I worked for had a great saying, which is, "Bad news doesn't get better with age."
Yes.
To Kim's point, the problems that are sitting underneath the technical problems, and you all know that the technical problems are many and they're interesting, but there is yet so much more complexity in the human level of the problems, in language, in culture, in the inescapability of bias. And I wanted to sort of put in mind for all of you a question that we'd like to leave you with, which is there's a very lucid question about governance that was a headline for an OpenAI blog post last year. And the headline was, "How should AI systems behave and who gets to decide?" And the question that I'd like to leave you with is, governance is about the design of intelligent systems. So who designs those systems and who gets to decide how they work? Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Miller.